How's it going, everyone? It's Nathan from Nathan's DIY Garage, and today I'm going to show you what to look for when buying a BMW E39 or E36 with the M52 engine. Okay, so the M52 is found on the 96 and 98 BMW E39. It's also found on the 96 and 99 BMW E36 and some of the Z3s. So let's just give a scenario. You get on Craigslist. These cars are getting pretty cheap, a little bit broken. You could buy one of these cars for what, $500 to $1,000 that are broken. And a lot of you are going to ask me, what do you need to do to be able to maintain and actually be able to daily drive one of these cars? So first of all, we're going to start off with, when you open the hood, you're going to look at it. You're going to see if the fan shroud is still on it. That's one common failure point. It likes to crack around the bottle here, and this one's all been replaced, so it's really nice. So the first thing I'm going to look at is that. You're going to look for any kind of white residue to see if it's been overheated. Now, a lot of you guys are going to buy these cars with a bad head gasket, or supposedly a bad head gasket. So you start it up, it's going to smoke, right? Okay, so, first of all, to do the head gasket job, it never is a head gasket. It's always a crack in the head on these engines. They just kind of do that when they get overheated. So you will need the timing tools. The timing tools for this engine are about $89 to set the timing. You will need another cylinder head. They're getting pretty expensive. They're $250 to $500 off eBay for one that's not cracked. So if you guys are doing that, I have other videos of that up. So next thing we're going to look at here is what are you going to look for inspection wise. Let's say the car still runs and it's on Craigslist. It's running like crap. It has lean codes. It has a rough idle and all of that. So the first thing we're going to look at is the throttle body boot. Throttle body boot's right here. You're going to want to look for cracks in the throttle body boot. This one's been replaced. It's all nice and soft still. A lot of these will crack down in here along there. A lot of them will actually break. Let me try to get in the right light here for you guys. They'll actually break right here as the boot goes down to the cold air, or to the auto control valve, ICV. It'll have a split right there. A lot of times the rubber hose going back to the ICV is bad. And a lot of times the ICV itself, which sits back up in here, will actually be stuck where the car's been sitting. And that'll cause lean codes and be hard to start or rough idle, etc. So the nice thing about the E39s of this engine, you could just go ahead and pull out the cabin air filter box on each side, and you could actually get to the back of the motor real easily. So another real common failure on these engines are on the very back here. If you reach back here, you can feel a rubber hose, a 1-inch rubber hose. And a lot of times that hose is a coolant hose. It'll actually rupture. Now, every car I get in, I always reach back there and feel of it and see if it's getting bulged out where it comes out of the cylinder head. It's kind of hard to get to, but if you pull this air box out, it's really not that bad. Something, if you check into early on before you have a problem, that'll save you a lot of grief on the interstate. That's probably one of the most common failures of these cars. That hose blows and then you overheat and crack your head. Okay, so the next problem is the CCV. As you can see, this one's already had silicone hoses put on. It's running a catch can. This catch can's actually just running open as a vent. There's no vacuum going to it. So the CCV valve, or the crankcase ventilation, will sit under here. So a lot of times the diaphragm will rupture. A lot of times I take them off, throw them away, and do a catch can setup. Another problem is the hose that goes up to the valve cover. The factory hose is hard plastic and it'll actually break, and that'll cause a real bad vacuum leak. Also, the hose going to the dipstick tube from the CCV, it runs back here to this tube right here, and in the bottom of the dipstick tube, it wires off and has a vacuum line, or an oil return hose, you might say. A lot of times that'll ride off. That'll cause an oil leak and a vacuum leak. Also, the dipstick tube itself likes to leak. There's a little grommet where it pushes into the oil pan. Those are common failures. At this point in time, as many of these I've actually done, the valve covers, the cover itself is terrible about cracking. And what'll happen, and this car actually has it too, I can't really video it for you, it's hard to see. You can see some residue, oily residue up here. You'll actually get a crack going down to the bolt hole, or just, down in the cover itself. Once you take this cover here off, you can see it on the main cover. That's really common. Another common problem is water leaking through the windshield wiper squirter up here. It likes to drip through that, and it likes to drip through this guy here, especially if you don't have a little plug on it. And rainwater will actually get number 5 or number 6. So when you start it up, it'll be running all rough, and you pull that coil pack out and it'll have rainwater in it. On E39, that's really common. As far as the E36, that's not as common on those. The hood setup a little bit different. Another oil leak problem is the oil filter housing, where it bolts to the block down here. It likes to leak out of there. That's not that hard of a fix. You take the power steering pump reservoir off. Usually you get to it pretty easy. You may or may not take the alternator off of this car, and you just reseal it and put it back on. That's not really too much of a money problem. It's just a little bit of time consuming to get that done. As far as oil leaks, that's really about the worst oil leak on these. Is the dipstick tube, is the oil filter housing, and the valve cover itself. And as far as coolant failures, basically these cars aren't too bad. These aren't as bad as the newer BMWs that has the push lock hoses. These still are the old clamp style, and these hoses can leak. They can get pinholes in them. As you can see, this one has already been upgraded to aluminum housing thermostat, so that's been all done. Otherwise, the thermostat housings like to crack. Also the pulleys, the idler pulley, and that's the same on anything. If you can see it back here or not, I don't know. There's an idler pulley and a tensioner pulley, and those bearings like to go out and they'll squeal. You know, it sound like a RC car. It'll screech when you start it up. A lot of times they'll do it on a cold start. If you catch it in time when they start doing it on cold start, they won't come apart. If you keep running it, the pulleys are actually plastic on the serpentine belt, and they'll actually melt the pulley and derail the belt, and then you overheat. Obviously that turns the fan, it turns the water pump and all that stuff. Also, another common problem is the crankshaft sensor. They like to fail. It's once you get a higher mileage on these cars, and that has changed. You guys can look at my other videos. I have videos up of changing that. You pull this air box out, you go down here on the side of the engine block with the long extension, and you could actually take the one little bolt out and change that pretty easily. They're not very expensive. One thing you got to remember on these engines, you have to go with at least a name brand. It don't have to be OEM. It needs to be at least a Bosch or something like that when it comes to the crank sensor and the cam sensor up here. These cars do not like the aftermarket Chinese sensors on them. It tends to make the check engine light stay on and cause idle problems. So another important issue on any BMW is people like to put power steering fluid in the power steering. Well, anything else that's fine. On BMW you cannot do that. You have to use ATF, automatic transmission fluid. If you put regular power steering fluid in it, it's a clear, really thin fluid, and it tends to make everything leak from the reservoir to the hose clamps, makes it leak going into the power steering cooler, and this causes tons of problems. And eventually, if you keep running that, it'll actually break the shaft off the pump and snap the pump and run your pump. Not to mention, I'm sure it could also cause premature rack and pinion wear and all kinds of nasty stuff. That's a real common problem. Also, a thing to remember on the reservoir here, there is a filter in the bottom of it that needs to be changed every so often. They're less than $20 to replace that. That's also a good time to change the fluid. You change the fluid by breaking the fitting loose on the pump down here and draining the whole system. That's a really common failure. You see a lot of BMWs driving around, you can hear the power steering squealing. That is usually what's going on with that. So in relation to the valve cover leaking, a lot of guys swap this with the M50 valve cover. The M50 is the 91 E34, E36 engine all the way up to 95. It has a metal valve cover, and it's basically the same setup. It's just the OBD1 system instead of the 96 and up OBD2 system. Also, another common problem or another common swap is the intake. To swap to the M50 intake, you can see the runners on this thing, and as we clip over to the C36 with the M50, you can see how fat the runners are on this one. And when you take it apart, you could actually see the runners are tremendously bigger on the M50. And this is the steel or the aluminum valve cover I'm talking about. Actually, I think it's magnesium to be exact. And this is a swap for the M52 engine. That's a pretty common swap. And once the swap is done, you notice this car does not have a CCV. It just has a rubber vacuum line going up to the intake, the little adapter that plugs into it. So by changing over to this intake, you also get bigger runners and you get rid of all your CCV problems at the same time. So clipping back over to the M52, this does have the same vanel setup as the M50 does. Okay, so the vanel seals do go bad. They don't go bad very often on these. Usually in higher mileage situation, you'll pull the aluminum vanel seating off the front, you put new seals in it, they're about 30 bucks. That could cause cold start problems if that's bad. That could also cause surging throttle response. So under a load and you're accelerating, by holding the pedal in one spot, it'll surge power off and on. Those are telltale signs of bad vanel seals. Other than that, really guys, there's not a whole lot else. Keep your coil packs checked, make sure they're not going bad. Keep your spark plugs changed. That'll help your coil packs from going bad. And that's really about it, man. There's really not a lot to these engines. They're really pretty simple. If you just have a simple scanner, you can read any code on this engine without a problem. Also on the E36 and E39, watch out for the electric fans in the front. I had a video last week where we had auxiliary fan problems, and not just on the M52 engines, on any of the BMWs that have that. You got to make sure the fan's turning right. That'll also cause an overheating problem in idle. So I don't buy a lot of these M52s anymore. When I do buy one, there's a few things guaranteed you have to do. You got to reseal a valve cover gasket or try to fix a crack in it. I always pull the radiator shroud out, and we'll go ahead and check the water pump down here. That bolts on the back of the fan. If that's a plastic impeller, the impeller likes to snap off. So before I can call these cars reliable, I'll put a metal impeller water pump on it. Usually we'll go with the metal thermostat housing. CCV delete. Almost always a new boot is needed. Check the coolant line in the back. Check the dipstick oil ring as it goes in the oil pan for leaks. And pretty much, once you do that, you let this car run, you let it idle, you slide a piece of cardboard under it or watch the concrete underneath of it, and check for anything dripping. If there's any kind of dripping, you need to get on it right away. And of course it goes for any BMW. Before you get in the car and just drive it, you need to check the transmission fluid level. I have videos on that up. You need to check the Driveshaft carrier bearing. You need to check the Guibo bushing on the Driveshaft. You need to check the transmission mounts. You need to check the control arms on the front. I have videos on that also. On that, you just push the tire actually back like this. These are good. It's hard to show you. You don't want any play on the front tires. You shouldn't be able to push them back at all. And that's it, guys. That's pretty much all the problems you need to look for on these cars. If you follow this little checklist, you might say, you could actually drive a cheap BMW for almost no money.